Hello everyone, my name is David Connolly and this video is designed to give you a quick overview of the size and the location of the heat demand primarily in a European context. I'm creating this video because I think you'll be very surprised to see just how big and where exactly the heat demand is located. Just to give you a quick overview at the start, this presentation will include all electricity demand, so buildings, industry and transport, although transport is very small, as well as the heat demands for buildings and industry, along with the coal demands for buildings. Transport is not included here because I didn't have the statistics to hand, and also I think my points will be demonstrated with the others on their own anyway. The main sources for the data is Eurostat, the European Statistics Office, as well as 3 recently published journal articles, 2 of which are part of the Heat Roadmap Europe series. So just to begin with one of the surprising numbers from the Heat Roadmap Europe project, this slide presents the electricity, heat and cooling demands in Europe for the year 2010. And what you can see here is that the electricity demand on the very left hand side is actually smaller than the heat demand for buildings only. Whereas if we add the heat demand for buildings and industry together, then the heat demand is actually almost twice as big as the demand for electricity in Europe today. This is quite surprising for many people to see just how big the heat demand is in comparison to electricity consumption, because if you reflect on that for a minute, these numbers mean that the electricity we consume for all purposes is actually around half of what we consume for heating in buildings and industry combined. Another surprising fact for many people is that the cooling demand is so small in Europe. Many people expect that the cooling demand is much higher in southern Europe than the heating demand, and they expect that the heat demand is only high in northern Europe where it's actually cold. However, what we have found in Heat Roadmap Europe is that the heat demand is high all over Europe, and that means that the cooling demand, as you can see in this slide, is a fraction of what the heat demand is in both buildings and industry. So this gives you a quick snapshot of what the demand profile is in Europe today, and if we look at the mix then in a more detailed level, we can see that adding all of these up together and look at how the individual parts break down, we can see that electricity accounts for about 1/3 of all the demands combined, while heating accounts for about 2/3 if you add buildings and industry together. Cooling demands then represent a very small share at only approximately 2%. Another thing as well as the total demand is where exactly it's located. And on the left hand side, I've created a very simple presentation of what people imagine when they think of the location of the heat demand. And this is just a simple diagram. It's not reflecting anything in particular, but it just shows the idea that people have when they see some of our presentations at the beginning, and they expect that what we're about to tell them is that in the north of Europe it's very cold and therefore we need a lot of heating, while in the south of Europe it's very warm and therefore we need a lot of cooling. And in fact, this is not at all how the heat and cooling demands are distributed across Europe, and instead they're much more closely linked to our population distribution than they are to our latitude or north or south of Europe. So in Heat Roadmap Europe, we have created the first ever heat atlas for all of Europe, which we call the Pan-European Thermal Atlas, or PETA for short. And this actually maps the location of the heat demand on a 1 km² resolution across all EU member states. And what we found when we did that mapping exercise was that around 50% of the heat demand in Europe is located in densely populated urban areas, and as a result the heat demand is distributed much more closely to building structure than it is to the altitude at which you live. We can see, just to give you a sense of what I mean by urban structure, this diagram illustrates some of the typical zones that people refer to in urban planning. On the very left you have, let's say, the natural zone or the rural areas where there's no buildings and just countryside, and as you move to the center we get to the suburbia where there's a mix of rural and urban, and then slowly as we go to the right hand side we get to densely populated urban districts. And what we have found in Heat Roadmap Europe is that there's really high heat demands in these urban zones where lots of buildings are located close to one another. One of the statistics that demonstrate that is if we look at how these demands are varied across Europe, across the different member states. These are the same demands I presented earlier for all of Europe, Europe, but this time divided by individual countries. And what you can see is that regardless of the latitude of the country, the electricity demands represent around a third, while the heating demands represent the remaining 2/3. So this just illustrates how demands are not necessarily varying depending on whether you're in a hot or cold country, but are instead very similar across all countries. You can see that cooling is very small also, with the exception of a few member states like Cyprus, which you can see here on the left, Greece in the center, Malta just a bit to the right, and then finally Spain here on the extreme right. And they have relatively large penetrations at 10 to 20% of the total demands, but they're still much smaller than many people would expect. Most people would expect that the cooling demand is much higher than this in countries like Spain and Greece and so on. So this just puts into context, number one, how the heat demand is very similar across most countries, and number two, just how large the heat demand is, and therefore illustrating how important it is to consider it in the decarbonisation of our energy system. In Heat Roadmap Europe 3, we developed very detailed heat atlases for 5 individual member states in Europe, and using these heat atlases, we tried to quantify how much of the total heat demand in each of these countries is within these highly populated urban areas. And here you can see some of the results, which indicate that for the Czech Republic, Croatia and Romania, around 40% of the heat demand was in these densely populated urban areas, while for countries like Italy and the UK, it was much higher at 60 to 70%. We also have a much more detailed online interactive atlas which you can access on our website and zoom into particular cities if they're of interest to you. As I mentioned earlier, this is done at a level of 1 by 1 kilometer, so you can zoom into a particular town or city if you want to see how the heat demand is distributed or how big it is in any particular city. But moving on then, why is this so important? Why is it so important we understand the size of the demands and exactly where they're located? And there's 2 key reasons that I want to highlight. First of all, understanding the breakdown of these demands informs us about the solutions we can use to decarbonize them. And number 2, the size of these demands illustrates how important it is for us to consider the energy system and not just the electricity system when we talk about decarbonization in the future. And I want to elaborate just very briefly on those 2 points. So starting with the first one. As we highlighted earlier about the EU28 mix, we looked at the breakdown of the different demands, and in that we looked at how the heat demand in buildings represented just over a third of all demands, and looking at the mapping results, we found that around half of that is in areas of high population densities. And now when I presented a previous video, I talked about the 3 key pillars in the heating sector, and 2 of those key pillars were about the types of supply that we can use. In urban areas, we can use heating networks, which are possible because the buildings are located close enough to one another to share an infrastructure, and that shared infrastructure can be a gas grid or a water grid, which we strongly recommend is the water grid or the district heating system. While in the urban in the rural areas, which are sparsely populated, the buildings are not located close enough to one another to share an infrastructure, so therefore they need their own individual heating technology within the building itself. And those can be in the form of oil boilers or biomass boilers, heat pumps or electric heating, or even solar thermal panels on the roof. And those of you who follow the Heat Roadmap Europe work will know that we strongly recommend electric heat pumps and solar thermal panels as the primary form of heating in the future. So by understanding the breakdown of the different demands, we can then understand what the potential is for these different types of supply. So for example, by understanding that around 50% of the heat demand is in urban areas, we know that that is the possibilities that district heating has in order to supply our heat in the future, while understanding that the other 50% is in more sparsely populated rural areas, then we know that that actually has to be supplied with an individual heating technology. So having this deeper understanding of how the demand is related to specific different areas gives us a better understanding of the type of technologies we can use to decarbonize those areas in the future. In Heat Roadmap Europe 4, we're expanding a lot of this work further by developing the same tools for 14 countries rather than just the 5 countries that we had in Heat Roadmap Europe 3. We're also updating the amount of information we have about the breakdown of these different demands, improving our mapping, and ultimately using all of this information to produce low carbon heating and cooling strategies for all 14 of these countries. In Heat Roadmap Europe 3, we developed 5 heating and cooling strategies and while in Heat Roadmap Europe 4, we'll expand that to cover 14 EU member states. Going back then to my second key point about the benefits of all of this is that this illustrates why it's so important to have an energy system focus and not an electricity system focus. Quite often when we talk about decarbonization, people put electricity at the center of the solution. This is illustrated in the diagram here, which is about smart grids. And as you can see, a lot of the focus is on electricity solutions. One of the good examples here is how renewable energy is focusing only on electricity, with wind power and solar power and hydropower the only ones mentioned as an example, excluding many of the other options which exist in other sectors, such as the heating sector. And by looking at it from an electricity, we need to change this perspective in the future to avoid looking at this decarbonization problem as an electricity problem, and instead look at it as an energy system problem. And that's something we promote quite a lot in the smart energy systems concept that we've developed here at Aalborg University, which is all about looking at the energy system as one complete unit and highlighting the importance of increasing the interaction between these different sectors in order to cost effectively decarbonize it in the future. There's a lot of videos about the concept itself at smartenergysystem.eu, so I won't go into much more detail in this video. It's simply to highlight the importance of having this holistic approach in the future. One good example from this particular video of what happens if we don't have a holistic approach comes from the demands that I just talked about. If I go back to my original statistics and remove all of the demands except the electricity demands, then you can see that we're only looking at a third of our problem, because the electricity demand only represents a third of all the demands considered in this presentation. So if we don't have an energy system focus, we're not tackling the whole problem, and instead with an electricity system focus, we're only solving a third of our challenges. I hope you got some interesting insights into the size and location of the heat demand in this particular presentation. There's more information on the heatroadmap.eu website. You can follow us on Twitter, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks very much for listening.